Hi, I'm Isaac, and welcome to Stuff You Need to Know About Australian History. In 1972, 23 years of coalition government came to an end. The following 2.5 years would be times of great change for Australia. Too much to cover in a single YouTube video, so we'll focus on three aspects: changing racial attitudes, economic deregulation, and increasing Australian nationalism. First, let's have a quick summary of the chronology. Labor was elected in 1972 and Gough Whitlam became Prime Minister. Despite the many reforms of his government, the economy suffered and cabinet ministers became involved in a borrowing scandal known as the Loans Affair, and the Senate blocked Whitlam's budget in October 1975. 1 month later, on the 11th of November, the Whitlam government was dismissed by Governor-General Sir John Kerr. Kerr replaced Whitlam with Malcolm Fraser of the Liberal Party. He went on to win 3 elections before losing to Labor's Bob Hawke in 1983. Hawke became Australia's longest-serving Labor Prime Minister, staying in office until he was dropped by the party in favour of Treasurer Paul Keating in 1991, who went on to win the 1993 federal election. One of the major reforms of the Whitlam government was the abolition of the White Australia policy. While some tweaks had been made to the policy in the 1950s and the 1960s, this was the first time that Australian immigration law truly treated all races equally, with racial equality enshrined in the Racial Discrimination Act, and reflected by the Australian government policy of multiculturalism. Now, this reform was important, but it's also a good example of government policy not really matching up with social reality. Immigration numbers dropped by nearly 2/3 under Whitlam, and there was no significant change in the racial makeup of Australian society. This would remain true until the mid to late 1970s, when large numbers of Vietnamese refugees settled in Australia. Their arrival was welcomed by Liberal Prime Minister Fraser, a great believer in racial equality. He would go on to introduce the Special Broadcasting Services in 1978 as Australia's multicultural channel. So modern Australian multiculturalism is less a result of careful policy planning and more a result of historical luck. You don't get much more Australian than that. This growing ideal of racial equality also applied to Aboriginal Australians, though given circumstances today, it's questionable how successful policies have been. As mentioned last time, in 1967, a referendum allowing the federal government to make laws for Indigenous Australians was carried in all 6 states, with an overall majority of over 90%. This notwithstanding, it wasn't until the 1970s that the practice of removing Indigenous children from their parents, the stolen generations, was entirely discontinued. Also significant were changes in laws on the matter of land. As you'll hopefully remember from our first episode, attachment to land is very important in Aboriginal culture. And as you'll remember from our second episode, one of the first things Europeans did upon settling Australia was steal the Indigenous people's land. In 1975, after 9 years of protest and striking, the Gurindji people, led by Vincent Lingiari, had their traditional lands in the Northern Territory returned to them by the Whitlam government. The really big change came in 1992 when the High Court handed down its judgment in the case of Mabo versus Queensland. This judgment recognised for the first time that Indigenous Australians had owned Australia before Europeans arrived and may still have rights to unclaimed land. This overturned the doctrine of terra nullius and established the doctrine of native title. The judgment was vague and one of the 7 justices opposed it, but it had significant effects. The Keating Labor government introduced the Native Title Act the following year to specify the workings of native title. Keating even declared that the Senate would sit until Christmas Eve and return on Boxing Day if the bill had not yet been passed. That same year, 1993, Keating gave his famous Redfern address, marking the first time in Australian history that a Prime Minister acknowledged the damage that European Australia had inflicted upon Aboriginal Australia.
It begins, I think, with an act of recognition. Recognition that it was we who did the dispossessing. We took the traditional lands and smashed the traditional way of life. We brought the diseases and the alcohol. We committed the murders. We took the children from their mothers. We practiced discrimination and exclusion. It was our ignorance and our prejudice and our failure to imagine that these things could be done to us. With some noble exceptions, we fail to make the most basic human response and enter into their hearts and minds. We fail to ask, how would I feel if this was done to me? As a consequence, we fail to see that what we were doing degraded us all.
The importance of the Native Title Act notwithstanding, the Hawke-Keating team is best remembered for its economic reforms, namely the liberalisation of the Australian market. Tariffs were lowered dramatically to encourage Australian industries to be more innovative by forcing them to compete with international corporations. They also floated the dollar, introduced compulsory superannuation and reformed the Australian taxation system. The average Australian grew richer, which led to more spending on goods and services. The spending caused the economy to overheat, and a stock market crash in 1987 saw the country slip into recession. Keating said of this, "Australia is in a recession. The most important thing about that is that this is a recession that Australia had to have." You can imagine how popular that made him. Anyway, what's unique about the 80s economic deregulation in Australia is that it was undertaken by a Labor government. In the United Kingdom, it was managed by the Conservatives under Margaret Thatcher, and in the United States by Republican President Ronald Reagan. There were two major consequences of this. Firstly, it was conducted in cooperation, not confrontation, with the trade unions. Secondly, government spending on social services actually increased during this time, and at a higher rate than most other OECD nations. This idea of a third way in politics between the left and the right would later be emulated by Bill Clinton in the United States and Tony Blair in the United Kingdom. Australians themselves were growing more proud of their Australian identity at this time, with the growing Australian art and media industry. This was reflected by government policy, which increasingly moved Australia away from Britain. In the 70s, Whitlam replaced God Save the Queen with Advance Australia Fair as the national anthem. In the 80s, Hawke disallowed Australian appeals to the Privy Council, meaning that Australian matters would be dealt with by Australian courts. In the 90s, Keating spruiked an Australian republic, and the idea became widely popular. However, before Keating could achieve this, he was defeated at the 1996 federal election by John Howard. After over 20 years of reform, Howard promised to make Australians comfortable and relaxed. How comforting and relaxing was his tenure? We'll discuss that next time. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you then.